Hello there, my name is Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. In my last project, I cut up lots and lots of scrappy strips into 6-inch lengths. I had lots and lots of extras of these 6-inch strips with varying widths. And the bonus here is that for the previous project, I already had them sorted out into lights and darks. So an easy block to make with strips is a fence rail. So I had the idea of making a wonky fence rail, and for one square of 3 I would do dark, light, dark, and then for another square of 3 I would do light, dark, light, and then match them up going opposite directions. Here's a look at the view in black and white, so you can really see that dark and light contrast. Well, if you follow my channel, you know I like to binge watch shows and stitch easy projects. This fence rail block is so easy, you're just basically stitching strips together. You can chain piece to your heart's content. My first step for each and every block is going to be to stitch one dark to one light. Then whichever pair I'm making, or trio I should say, if I want the light on the outside, I'm going to set a light aside and I'm going to stack those up in the order that I'm stitching, and you'll see what I mean here in a minute. You can see I'm stitching one light to one dark, and you can tell they're not the same widths. I'm okay with that. But whichever one is going to belong to this, that little stack on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see those extra pieces are alternating light dark as well. So when I'm all done chain piecing, I can just go back through my stack and I will have the right piece for the right pair. Now it's time to separate my chain, and I'm making sure they're staying in the same order that I stitched them. Then all I have to do is flip my stack upside down, flip the stack of my extra strips upside down, and I'm ready to stitch on that third piece. Now it's time to separate these chains again, and instead of a pair, I now have trios. Now if you wanted to, you could press your trios. I did not. I'm going to press these blocks later, and they're going to be wonky anyway, so I'm really not worried about it. I am putting a trio of dark, light, dark, matching it up with a trio that's light, dark, light, and I'm making sure the rows are going opposite directions. So in this case, my dark, light, dark is horizontal. My light, dark, light strips are vertical. Another note, I am making sure that the top where I begin stitching does line up, but I know that the bottom, when I'm done stitching this pair, is not going to line up necessarily because the strips are wonky. Once I had pairs stitched together, I separated that chain, and then I began stitching 2 units together with 2 more units. Essentially what I've done here is take 3 strips and make a patch. Then I'm stitching all these together into what you would call a 4 patch. I am not worrying here about anything matching up too closely. I know these are wonky. I know the widths of my strips are all different, so there is really no way these are going to match up on the center seam. They might, but most likely they won't. And I think that's one of the reasons scrap projects are so great for binge watching or just relaxing, listening to an audiobook. You really don't have to match things. This is scrappy. This is not supposed to be a fancy block. By using up your scraps, you're keeping this fabric out of the trash, out of a landfill, and you're making something beautiful that will be loved and keep someone warm. Now it's time to separate these blocks and decide how I'm going to put them together. I have not pressed any part of these blocks until now. Once I had this part done and I had my 4-patch put together, I did press all my blocks. And somehow I came out with an even number of blocks. I came out with 36 blocks. So I'm going to think about a 6x6 layout. I decided to just trim each block, preserving as much fabric as possible. And you can see I'm setting aside little pieces that are 1 inch wide or more, and everything else will just be too small to save. On this very last block, I wanted to pause and just talk about it for a minute. If you were making a fence rail block the normal way, these center seams would line up. You'd be able to line up lines on your ruler and get a nice straight trim. But you can see these blocks are wonky. I've got them going at one angle on the upper left, they're going a different angle on the lower right. There's really nothing to match up. So I'm just eyeballing the straightness. It's subjective. I'm just making sure it looks good to my eyes, and then I'm going ahead and trimming. Well, I took a look at some of the measurements of these blocks, and after reviewing that, I was able to sort them into 2 piles. They're not identical measurements, but they're close. So I have one stack of blocks that are slightly smaller than the other stack of blocks. Now that I had 2 stacks, I combined those. I put the smaller ones on top, and I simply started taking from the stack and chain piecing 2 blocks together. All right, once I had those chains separated, it was time to sew 2 blocks to 2 blocks. Once I had 2 blocks stitched together to 2 other blocks, my little tail end there is long enough. I'm just going to flip this over closer to my needle. I'm going to put my next set of 2 right on top. And without separating or cutting my thread, I'm going to go ahead and stitch that 3rd pair to complete my row. Once I had all the rows stitched together, I trimmed all the wonky edges and made sure these rows were straight on both sides. To do that, I'm lining up my ruler with one straight edge and keeping the trim line the exact same distance from the opposite side. Now you'll see me measuring these rows. The shortest row was about 53 inches, if I'm remembering correctly, and I think the longest one was 55 inches, so they really weren't that different. I wanted to put some sashing between my rows and on the right and the left side of this quilt top. I found this beautiful, beautiful blue in my stash. This fabric was almost 1 yard. It was an inch or two short. I cut this yardage into 2.5 inch strips. Next, I stitched all my strips together so I could use that for sashing and for the outside of my quilt. By flipping around the tail end of the strip I just stitched and adding to it, I'm going to end up with a long strip. When all the strips are stitched together, I'm going to be trimming off those excess triangles. Then I'm going to press this long strip flat. Next, I'm going to stitch this sashing right sides together. I'm going to stitch it to one side of each row, and then on the 6th row, I'm going to stitch sashing to both sides of the row. Next, I am going to stitch 2 rows together. What you see me doing is pinning the rows together first. I'm making sure the sashing is joining up with a side of a row that does not have sashing. And remember, my rows are not all the same length, and that's okay. After stitching these together, I had 3 pairs of rows. So I started pinning one pair to another pair. Then I went ahead before I stitched this and I flipped it open and I pinned on that last pair. So now I can just go to the sewing machine, stitch these 2 seams, and my rows will all be joined. Now you won't see it in this video, but after I stitched all the 6 rows together, I did trim the right and the left sides of this quilt top. Next, I pinned my 2.5 inch strip to the right and the left side. You may have heard of something called bobbin chicken. Apparently I was playing sashing chicken. This is all the 2.5 inch strip that is left. I just barely had enough. Let's get these last 2 strips stitched on. The very last thing I did to complete this quilt top was to trim off any little extra edges on those strips. You know, many of my projects, I have no idea what's going to happen when I start. This one I just love. I love the blue sashing. I think that blue sashing really makes this a unified project, and I love the bright colors. I did want to give you a peek at it in black and white so you can see those light and dark pairs. There's something about doing it that way that makes a unified project. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you supporting my channel, and I do hope to see you back again real soon.